Hi everybody, I am Ron Cantor, still here in Jerusalem, and we are in the upper room just above the traditional site of King David's tomb. And we're talking about the Jewish aversion to Jesus. And we ended the last episode talking about his letter to the Romans, that he was combating growing anti-Semitism in this young church because they went 5 years without a Bible. They began to believe that God was against the Jewish people. And Paul pleads with them not to reject the Jewish people. He knows that if they do, it will bring judgment on them. He also knows and says in verse 12 that Jewish acceptance is going to bring a revival even greater than the book of Acts revival. So, did they listen to Paul? Sadly, they didn't. By the 2nd century, the idea that the church was the new Israel or had replaced Israel had become doctrine. In roughly 150 CE, Justin Martyr, in his apologetic, meaning his defense of the Christian faith, to a Jewish man named Trypho, he said, quote, "The true spiritual Israel and descendants of Judah, Jacob, Isaac, and Abraham are we who have been led to God through this crucified Christ." He argued that we who are of Christ are the true Israelite race. Now, some of you might think that that sounds great, except there's nothing in the New Testament that would confirm this. The New Testament speaks about a one new man being made up of Jew and Gentile, not Gentile or the church instead of the Jew. By the 4th century, it was not merely theology, but rabid anti-Semitism from the mouths and pens of Christian bishops. We would have hoped that with the first Christian emperor, Constantine, that the church would become friendlier towards the Jewish people, Jesus' natural brothers, that they would have sought to take the advice of Paul and provoke Israel to jealousy through acts of kindness and love. But instead, they became even more anti-Semitic. Listen to Dr. Michael Brown. But the early church quickly lost sight of Israel's special role and of the Father's covenantal love for his firstborn son, cursing its spiritual ancestors rather than blessing them. And soon an anti-Jewish cancer had infected the ranks. The disease is still spreading today. One of the first things that this new Christian emperor of Rome, Constantine, did is he changed Passover to Easter. Listen to his reasoning. It was declared to be particularly unworthy for this, the holiest of all festivals, meaning the resurrection or Easter, to follow the customs of the Jews, who had soiled their hands with the most fearful of crimes and whose minds have been blinded. In rejecting their custom, we may transmit to our descendants the legitimate mode of celebrating Easter, which we have observed from the time of the Savior's passion to the present day by using the Jewish calendar. We ought not, therefore, to have anything in common with the Jews, for the Savior has shown us another way. And consequently, in unanimously adopting this mode, we desire, dearest brethren, to separate ourselves from the detestable company of the Jews. For it's truly shameful for us to hear them boast that without their direction in the calendar, we could not keep the feast. It would be still your duty not to tarnish your soul by communications with such wicked people, referring to the Jews. Maybe the most vitriolic of all the anti-Semitic bishops was John Chrysostom. When I studied him in Bible school, I learned that he was called the Golden Mouth because he was so eloquent. There wasn't a word in our church history book about his rabid anti-Semitism. He was one of the most respected leaders of his day. But he became concerned because many in his church in Antioch, they were going to the Jewish synagogue to learn about the Jewish roots of their faith. To warn his flocks against this horrible thing, he preached 7 sermons titled Against the Jews. Nice title. This is how he referred to the biblical feasts that are laid out in the Torah. The festivals of the pitiful and miserable Jews are soon to march upon us, one after the other, and in quick succession. The Feast of Trumpets, the Feast of Tabernacles, the fast. He was deeply concerned that these Jewish feasts would infect his precious church like a virus. Chrysostom declared that it was every Christian's duty to hate the Jews. Here's one of his most famous quotes from his sermons against the Jews. "The synagogue is worse than a brothel. It's a den of scoundrels and a repair of wild beasts. the temple of demons devoted to idolatrous cults, the refuge of brigands and degenerates, and a cavern of devils. The synagogue is a criminal assembly of Jews. Again, this is a Christian bishop. He said the synagogue was a place of meeting for the assassins of Christ, a house worse than a drinking shop, a den of thieves, a house of ill fame, a dwelling of iniquity, a refuge of devils, a gulf and abyss of perdition. He was very descriptive. And that was what he said about the synagogue. Here's what he said about the actual Jewish people, about me, about my wife, my children, my grandparents, my uncles, my aunts. He said, I would say the same thing about their souls. And so as for me, I hate the synagogue and I hate the Jews for the same reason. Does this sound even remotely like the words of a Jesus follower? Yet he was the most revered and loved bishop of his time. The great theologian Augustine was slightly kinder than Chrysostom. Augustine was credited with saying that though the Jews deserved death for killing Jesus, that the only reason that God has left the Jewish people on earth was so that they could, quote, wander the earth to witness the victory of the church over the synagogue. I guess they had to come up with some reason that the Jewish people didn't get swallowed up into all the other nations like the Hittites, the Jebusites, the Philistines, because it sure would have been an easy way for God to say, hey, I'm done with the Jewish people, no more promises for them. The very fact that the Jewish people are here is proof that God has been faithful to his promises. But Augustine wrote that God had dispersed the Jews but had not destroyed them. In his view, God had kept the Jews alive as a permanent reminder that Christianity had replaced Judaism as the true faith. He argued that the humiliated, defeated Jews showed what happens to those who reject God's truth. Although Augustine did not want the Jews to be murdered, he did want them to suffer for what he claimed they had done to Jesus. And he wanted them to be present at the end of days, when Jesus returned, so that they could see how they had been wrong about Jesus. According to the historian Robert Wistrich, St. Augustine, he likens the Jewish people to Cain, the first criminal recording in history. And Cain, he was able to live and go from every place to every place, but everybody knew he had a mark, so everybody would know that he was a murderer. And he felt that the Jewish people, we would be allowed to live, but we would have to wear some sign, if you will. I think Hitler must have read that to show that we were the murderers of the Messiah. Yes, Augustine did want the Jews to be around at the end of times so they could witness their failure. But the fact is that there will be a mass turning to faith from Jewish people to the Messiah in the future. But by declaring that the Jewish people deserve death for the crime of killing Jesus is horribly anti-Semitic. I'm Jewish. I had nothing to do with killing Jesus. I believe in him and I love him. Things did not get better for the Jewish people, but far worse. While Chrysostom's rhetoric called for violence, it was primarily just rhetoric. But over the next 1,000 years plus, it would go from being rhetoric to expulsion to murder. And that's where we'll pick up in our next episode. Thanks so much for watching.